Hello everyone. Today we'll talk about commercialization of agriculture in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1750s to 1857. In the context of the various policies in the economy which were followed by the British, we find that commercialization of agriculture was an important aspect which is associated with regard to the economic policies which were followed by the British in India, and how these kinds of policies which were followed by the British in the context of the economy, how to what extent they tried to commercialize the agricultural practices which were in India, whether the kind of impact which they created in the context of the peasants, that how famines and other kinds of depravities which were caused due to these kinds of policies which were followed by the British, the revenue settlements, permanent settlement, Rayati settlement and Mahalwari settlements, all these three settlements which were introduced by the British, how they changed the land relations in India and how they created an impact on the Indian economy and the Indian society. So these are some of the things which we will discuss today. In the context of the references, you can refer to Bibhuti Chaudhary's Growth of Commercial Agriculture in Bengal, Sumit Sarkar's Modern India, Shaukat Mukherjee, Some Aspects of Commercialization in Eastern India, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's From Palasi to Partition, History of Modern India. So these are some of the readings which you can refer while one is talking about the commercialization of agriculture during the colonial times, and how this commercialization created some kind of an impact on the Indian society and economy. So in this context, first we have to understand what is commercialization. Commercialization is when we are producing the cash crops, and the focus is on the crops which are not the food grains but which are able to generate cash when they are grown and sold at that point of time. So why these cash crops they were being grown? One was the British need for these products to further its industrial development, because the industrial revolution had taken place in Britain and we find that they needed raw material. Secondly, the contemporary global developments were another important factor, and thirdly, the policy followed by the British in India. So we find that if we try to locate the reasons for the commercialization of agriculture, then we will find that due to the industrial revolution in Britain and the need for the raw materials, it demanded that these raw materials they should be grown in far off lands, because if you see the size of Britain, then everything to grow everything was not possible, and the temperatures and the climate was not suitable. So the colonies they were being used to grow the kind of products or the raw materials which were required for the British industries. If we see the contemporary global developments in the context of the kind of changes which were happening in the 18th-19th century, they were also responsible for the commercialization of agriculture in India. And the kind of policy which was followed by the British in India, where they wanted to maximize their profits, they were more concerned with their profits. That was the main criteria in terms of following their policy. And what we also find is that how these cash crops they benefited beneficial to the Indian farmers to an extent, but if in the long run when we try to understand the dynamics, then we will find that a lot of coercion or exploitation was being used in the cultivation of these cash crops, and in the long run most of the farmers they suffered. If we see the kind of focus of the land revenue policy, that the revenue was to be paid in cash, and most of the times it was burdensome for the peasants to pay the land revenue in cash. So we find that the peasants they shifted from cultivation of food grains to that of cash crops, because when they will produce the cash crops, then they will be able to sell them at that point of time when they are harvested, and they will be able to generate that kind of a cash which could be given to the British as land revenue. So that was the kind of idea with regard to the peasants when they were cultivating these kind of crops, and sometimes they were also guided by the issue of profits. But in the long run we find that the soil it became infertile in certain regions because of the cultivation of crops like indigo, and it was detrimental to the Indian agriculture in the long run. So if we see that why these kind of cash crops they were being grown, then we will find that cash crops they were being grown on a large scale during this period, and incentives they were being offered by the East India Company and other private traders in the form of loans and advances. And that is why the cash crops they were being grown on a larger scale from this time. So we find that East India Company was ready to offer the kind of incentives in terms of advances to the people and how to the agriculturalist or the peasants. And these peasants they needed cash, so or some kind of a loan, so that they can buy the equipments in the sense that they could buy the seeds, etc., so that they can invest those seeds in agricultural practices. So these kind of advances which were being provided by the East India Company and other private traders, it facilitated the people, those who were engaged in agriculture. And if we tend to understand the kind of changes which were happening at the international level, we will find that French Revolution, the indigo cultivation, it collapsed in France. Then secondly, Napoleonic continental blockade, it also in a way resulted in the stoppage of the supply of silk to England. Thirdly, the American Civil War and the revolt of slaves in America were working on the British plantations. They stopped supply of cotton and indigo. So we find that all these kinds of international developments, whether in the framework of the French Revolution, where you find that the cultivation of indigo it stopped. So now British in a way wanted that cultivation of indigo should be done in India, and many times the cultivation of indigo was quite coercive in nature. Secondly, we also find that how Napoleon was engaged in blockading, and because of which we find that the supply of silk was disrupted, which was being sent to Britain. And on the other hand, the civil war and the kind of revolt which was happening in these places, because of which we find that the British plantations now they were not supplying cotton and indigo. So all these kinds of factors they demanded that these kinds of crops they should be cultivated elsewhere. And India was one of the colonies, which was one of the important colonies in the context of Britain, where they were able to grow such kind of crops which were needed for them. Then Taipei Rebellion in China, it stopped the export of tea from China to Britain. So it also demanded that these kind of plantations or crops they are also being done in India. If we see the Crimean War, we find that that was a period of 1853 to 54, where the stoppage of the supply of jute from Russia to Britain. So we find that these kinds of global developments in the context of China, we see that British they were exporting a lot of tea from China to Britain, and Britain on the other hand was losing a lot of bullion because they had to pay to the Chinese in terms of bullion. So they devised a technique where now opium from India was being sent to China, and that kind of balance of payment crisis which could be in favor of Britain. Britain could have loss in terms of balance of payments. Now they were in a better position because the opium which was being sent from India to China, and then the kind of triangular trade it was established in that way. And on the other hand, tea was being exported from China to Britain, and the India was getting British Raj in return. So this is what Tan Chung explains in that context, that how this kind of a trade was in a way beneficial to the British, and on the other hand how Indians they were on a losing side. We also find the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 also helped in this process, that the way the trade could be done at a more convenient pace now, because the route became comparatively shorter. We also find that the telegraphic contact between India and England from 1855 onwards, it also favored cultivation of cash crops as foreign trade became easier. So these kind of developments in the context of telegraph also paved the way for the foreign trade to become easier during this time, and it also helped in the context of the cultivation of these crops. Later we also find from 1853 onwards that how railways, when railways got constructed, how these lines, they were connected to the port towns, and thereafter the raw materials, they were being exported to Britain from India, and how the finished products from Britain, they entered India, and how railways, they facilitated such kind of exchange. We also find that some of the scholars, they have tried to see commercialization in a particular context, and Ashok Sen, he says that commercialization of agriculture is an inevitable and essential feature of emergence and consolidation of capitalism. And he also says that such process is imbricated with dualities and regional variations, especially in the colonial countries, and it is not possible to homogenize historical impact of commercialization. So we find that the commercialization of agriculture in the context of different crops, they had different kind of impact in the various regions in which these cash crops, they were being grown. So it will not be possible in that sense that how there is some kind of an homogenization of the impact of commercialization, but we tend to understand that because of the commercialization of agriculture, the peasants, the way they were being exploited by the British, how the market got connected to the international market, because of which they lost in the long run. So these kinds of things, they happen, even though it may not be possible to have some kind of homogeneity in terms of impact. But if you see that how the peasants lost, then we are able to in a way judge, or in a way able to evaluate or analyze that commercialization of agriculture was beneficial to the British, but on the other hand, Indians, they had to lose in that sense. Other scholars like Bibhuti Chaudhary, he talks about the internal developments of communication, especially the railways, and how they linked the village economy with the urban market economy, and it was able to generate some kind of a demand. And he also talked in the context of the internal industries, that how they grew, and it also led to the growth of the cash crops. So we find that these scholars, they have tried to talk in the framework of the developments in the communications, and how earlier we talked about the telegraph, and thereafter the railways as well, that how railways, they were able to generate that kind of a demand, and how the markets, they were linked with the railways, and goods, they could be transported easily through the railway network, be it the raw materials or the finished products. So these kinds of developments in the internal industries, they also added to the growth of cash crops. Then Asiya Siddiqui talks about that how the combining of the rigid realization of revenue with requirement that the taxes be paid in cash, and forced the government monetization and commercialization, given periods, high levels of assessment. So how Siddiqui talks about that how the realization of revenue was taking place, and it was very rigid in nature, how peasants, they felt that they were being forced to pay such high revenue, and at the same time the ideas of sunset laws in the context of the permanent settlement, where they had to pay the land revenue on a particular date, and if that will not be done, then the zamindaris, they will be taken away. And it was happening in the context of the peasants as well, that they had to pay the money in cash, and the government was trying to force the kind of monetization, that more and more money is being generated, and the kind of by selling those crops. So they wanted the land revenue in cash, and this kind of a commercialization, we find that the levels of assessment were comparatively very, very high. Asiya Siddiqui also communicates that in order to pay revenue and to meet extortion attending its collection, the peasant had to sell his crop in advance to moneylender, later to buy or borrow from him whatever he needed for seed and food. Subsistence element in his economy was undermined, and monetization was induced. not because he had a surplus to exchange, but because necessity of paying his installments of revenue forced him to sell even his food and stock. So we find that was the kind of situation which was there for the peasants, because he had to pay the revenue and he had to listen to the British government, and that is why he was selling his crop in advance to the money lender, and thereafter when he sold his crop to the money lender at a lesser price, and thereafter whenever he needed that kind of a crop, he for seed or for food, he had to buy at a comparatively higher price. So the subsistence economy which was there in the earlier times, that situation got undermined, and monetization was there to see, and peasant did not have any kind of surplus in terms of exchanging, but he had to pay the installments of revenue, and that is why he was forced to sell his food and stock. So that was the kind of situation in which peasants, they were being forced, because of which they felt helpless, and how over a period of time the peasants, they did not have money and resources to sustain themselves. If we tend to understand the specific crops and the effects of these crops, then we will find that indigo, by 1840, indigo had firmly established as the largest dyeing material which was used in the world, and the units of production, they were being run by the British investor, and two types of cultivation they were being carried on. One was the Nijabat, or the cultivation directly undertaken under the supervision of British investors with help of hired labor. So in the context of indigo, we find that how British, they got engaged, and they were doing this kind of cultivation through two methods. One was the Nijabat, as I have communicated, and how indigo was very useful in the context, as it was one of the largest dyeing material which was used in the world. So when we tend to understand that these kinds of cultivation practices which were being introduced by the British during this time in the context of the various crops, be it cotton, sugarcane, indigo, opium, all of them we find that they were quite coercive in nature, and British, they used all sorts of methods, coercion or the system of advances which they were providing to the agriculturist, so that they were able to force them to grow such kind of cash crops. And in the long run, we find that such kind of practices, they prove to be counterproductive from the point of view of the peasants. And the other system which was used in the context of indigo was the Rayati system, or a contract system in which small farmers, they grew indigo on their lands and they received advances. So the peasants, they bore the expenses of the cultivation and had to hand over entire produce to planter at the fixed prices. So this was another system. This system, it involved coercion in the long run, as the low prices were fixed by the investor, and the peasants, they found it impossible to extricate himself from the debt. So that was the kind of system in terms of the cultivation of the cash crops, that Rayati system was quite coercive in nature, and how the cultivator or the peasant had to in a way hand over the produce to the planter at fixed prices. Apart from that, we also find that how during this period, Bibhuti Chaudhary, he talks about in the context of the development of Kusuki cultivation, that how cultivation by the peasants on their own accord, but it did not crystallize into any kind of well defined shape. So we find that the different kinds of experiments, they were being conducted in the cultivation of crops, and Bibhuti Chaudhary has argued in the context in the development of the Kusuki cultivation, where peasants, they were doing their own cultivation of their own accord, but we do not find that there was any kind of a well defined shape, or this kind of a cultivation was able to gain any kind of concrete shape. So we find that these kind of developments in the long run, they were detrimental to the interests of the farmers. Another important crop with regard to the commercialization was tea, and how we find that tea was owned and managed by the whites, and Britain used to import tea from China, but their relation got strained in 1830s. So attempts were henceforth made to grow tea in hilly areas of northern Bengal and Assam. Labor which was used in cultivation was of semi-servile nature, and we find that severe labor hardships could be seen, and the cultivation was also in the isolated areas. So we find that how this kind of a cultivation with regard to tea, because tea had become an important crop with regard to Britain. As British, they required a lot of tea, they became habituated in terms of drinking tea. And when China was not exporting the kind of tea to Britain, then they had to grow tea in other areas. And especially in India, when this kind of a cultivation was taking place, we find that the kind of labor which was used in the cultivation of tea was of a semi-servile nature, and they had to undergo a lot of hardships during the colonial period, because most of the cultivation was owned and managed by the whites, and the way they were being exploited, the way they were being made to work long hours, the way they were being oppressed by the colonial authorities in term, and they did not have any kind of rights to go to courts as well, because the Europeans, they could not be tried by the Indians. They were being tried even in the courts by the European judges as late as 1880s, 90s, and that was the kind of situation. So we find that when these kinds of things they were happening, and when there was hue and cry with regard to that, they had to be that they will be tried by the Indian judges, then even that reform was withdrawn by the British. So British, they were quite categorical in the context that they wanted to maintain their supremacy over India, and that is how they used all these kinds of tactics in different spheres, and economy was one of the most important areas where they made a lot of changes with regard to the cultivation techniques, with regard to the kind of crops which were to be cultivated, so that they were able to satisfy their demands in Britain. We also find that apart from that, opium was an important crop which was grown in the negligible quantity near Patna, and how Britain, they had encouraged its cultivation so that the bullion which was paid to the Chinese, so that Chinese tea could be sent to Britain, and the balance of trade could become favorable for Britain. And the system of advance was the basis of poppy cultivation, and the production also increased. So we find that initially opium was being grown in a very less amount, but over a period of time we find that how British, they were encouraging its cultivation, because they needed opium so that it could be exported to China, though it was a contraband and it could not be openly sent there. But there are so many manufacturers, so many traders, those who were not happy with the East India Company's trade, and the free traders or the private trade of the East India Company servants, they were ready to carry such kind of a trade with regard to China, that how they were able to send the opium to Chinese markets, and how Chinese, they developed this kind of a taste, and the balance of trade became favorable in the context of for the British. So we find that opium, the peasants, they were being coerced to grow such kind of crops at this point of time, and the government wanted that how they can derive more and more revenue out of such kind of cultivation. And poppy or opium was cultivated under heavy restrictions, and the system was not remunerative, but it was coercive. So we find that these kind of crops which were being grown by the British, they were being grown so as to increase their profits in India, in that sense that they did not want to pay money to the Chinese. They wanted to save their bullion, and they wanted to exercise their own monopoly over such kind of production, and that is how they exercise the monopoly over the production as well as the sale of opium. and we find that this system was not at all remunerative for the farmers, rather it was coercive in nature. In the next lecture, we will talk about the other crops and the kind of historiography which is associated with regard to the commercialization of agriculture. Thank you very much.